Alexander the Great crossed into Persian territory knowing exactly how empires were supposed to respond. They were supposed to block him. They were supposed to force a decisive battle at the frontier. They were supposed to defend their core. The Persian Empire did none of that. Instead, Alexander was allowed to advance deeper, farther, into a space so vast that every victory stretched his army thinner than the last. This war did not unfold as a contest of maneuver or bravery. It unfolded as a test of endurance, administration, and political gravity. So why did the largest empire on earth refuse to stop him early? Why did Persian command accept territorial loss without immediate resistance? And what happens when a conqueror's greatest success becomes a liability he can no longer carry? Because this was not passivity. It was a strategy that bet everything on one fragile assumption, that conquest collapses under its own weight. This episode is not about how Alexander the Great won battles. That story is already familiar. This episode is about a different question, one most histories avoid because it is uncomfortable. What if the Persian Empire did not primarily lose because it failed to stop Alexander, but because it gambled on a strategy that required time, cohesion, and internal discipline it no longer fully possessed? The strategic problem was not military inferiority. Persia still commanded manpower, resources, and geographic depth on a scale Macedonia could never match. The problem was structural. Persian leadership faced a dilemma with no clean solution. A decisive battle risked legitimizing Alexander through victory. But continuous retreat risked dissolving imperial authority from the inside. Choosing not to block Alexander early was therefore not indecision. It was an attempt to weaponize space, logistics, and political friction. To turn rapid conquest into administrative overload. To stretch a brilliant battlefield system beyond the point where brilliance still mattered. This makes the strategy deeply unconventional. And deeply dangerous. Because if the assumption failed, if Alexander adapted faster than the empire fragmented, then every mile of retreat would not weaken the invader. It would deliver him closer to the heart of power. And that risk is where the real story begins. Before any decision can be judged, the environment that produced it has to be understood. Not the battlefield. The system. By the time Alexander crossed into Asia Minor, this was not a war between equals, but it was also not a simple mismatch of strength. Alexander commanded a compact, aggressive force designed for speed, shock, and decisive engagement. Its power lay in cohesion. Its weakness lay in scale. The Persian Empire, by contrast, was not optimized for decisive confrontation. It was optimized for duration. Persia's true strength was not its field armies. It was its ability to absorb loss, shift resources, and survive disruption across an enormous geographic span. That strength only mattered if time could be bought. And time was the one thing Alexander's system required least. From the Persian perspective, several constraints shaped every option. First, geography. Persian territory was vast, but uneven. Control was strong along administrative corridors and symbolic centers, weaker in peripheral regions. A forward defense meant committing imperial legitimacy to frontier provinces whose loyalty was already conditional. Second, logistics. Any decisive battle fought early would be fought close to Persian supply hubs, but also close to Alexander's operational peak. Win, and the war ends quickly. Lose, and the empire hands over legitimacy in a single stroke. Third, political cohesion. The empire was not a monolith. Satraps governed with significant autonomy. Their loyalty depended on stability, protection, and confidence in the center. A failed early confrontation would not just cost troops. It would signal vulnerability. Fourth, time pressure. Persia could outlast Macedonia in theory. But only if the war slowed down. Only if conquest stopped feeling like momentum and started feeling like occupation. This created a paradox. Stopping Alexander early risked granting him the very thing he needed most. A decisive victory that validated his rule in the eyes of elites and local authorities. Letting him advance risked something else entirely. The erosion of imperial authority as territory was yielded without visible resistance. There was no clean path. What Persian leadership faced was not a choice between action and inaction. It was a choice between two forms of risk. One immediate. One delayed. Most military doctrine favors confronting risk early, before it compounds. But that doctrine assumes something crucial. That decisive engagement remains available as a stabilizing outcome. Persia was no longer certain that it was. Because Alexander's army was not just an invading force. It was a mobile legitimacy engine. Every battle won converted military success into political leverage. Local elites recalculated. Garrisons reconsidered. Neutral actors hedged. In that environment, an early defeat would not merely lose ground. It would rewire loyalty. So Persian command faced an unspoken question. What if the worst outcome was not territorial loss, but clarity? What if forcing a decisive moment too early simply resolved the war in Alexander's favor? This reframed the battlefield. The real contest was no longer over land. It was over time, friction, and the conversion rate between victory and control. Alexander's system required continuous forward motion to function. Pause weakened it. Dispersion endangered it. Persia's system, in theory, could survive pause. It had done so for generations. So instead of concentrating force to block Alexander, Persian leadership allowed space to open. Not as surrender, but as a bet. A bet that depth would dilute momentum. That administration would lag behind conquest. That loyalty would fracture under foreign rule faster than under imperial retreat. This was not a battlefield maneuver. It was a system-level gamble. And like all such gambles, it depended on assumptions that could not be tested in advance. Assumptions about Alexander's adaptability. About internal cohesion. About how long people would tolerate uncertainty before choosing sides. At this stage, nothing had failed yet. But nothing had been proven either. And it was precisely within these constraints, political, logistical, psychological, that a move most generals would never dare began to take shape. Military doctrine exists to reduce uncertainty. It tells commanders what usually works when information is incomplete and pressure is absolute. In this case, doctrine was clear. An invading force crossing into imperial territory is to be met early. Preferably at the frontier. If not there, then at a choke point that limits maneuver and supply. The logic is simple. Engage before the enemy can stabilize logistics. Force a decisive battle while their system is still fragile. End the war before momentum compounds. For most commanders in the ancient world, this was not even a debate. It was instinct. Alexander's army, for all its brilliance, was small relative to the Persian Empire. Its supply chain was long. Its home base was far away. A conventional response would have been to exploit these vulnerabilities immediately. That response did not happen. To understand why, we need to examine not what doctrine prescribed, but what doctrine assumed. Doctrine assumed that decisive battle remained a neutral tool, a mechanism that favored the stronger side. But decisive battle is only neutral when legitimacy is evenly distributed. In this war, it was not. Alexander did not need to win repeatedly. He needed to win once, publicly, unmistakably, and early. One decisive victory would do more than destroy an army. It would collapse resistance. Because the Persian system was not built on constant mobilization. It was built on acceptance. Satraps governed because they were recognized. Cities paid taxes because authority felt permanent. Loyalty was transactional, not ideological. A decisive loss would not merely reduce Persian military capacity. It would trigger a cascade of recalculations. Which side is the future? Which ruler can guarantee stability? Which authority is worth obeying tomorrow? Doctrine does not account for this kind of political conversion effect. It treats victory as subtraction. But here, victory was multiplication. Every win by Alexander increased his power faster than Persian losses reduced theirs. This created a distortion. The textbook solution, decisive engagement, carried asymmetric consequences. If Persia won, it preserved the status quo. If Persia lost, it accelerated collapse. This asymmetry made early confrontation far riskier than doctrine allowed for. There was another problem. Doctrine assumes that armies exist primarily to fight other armies. But Alexander's force was not designed to fight endlessly. It was designed to move. Its strength came from cohesion, command clarity, and forward momentum. Its weakness was dispersion. A conventional response would have sought to pin and destroy it. But pinning requires commitment. And commitment meant placing Persian legitimacy directly in harm's way. The deeper Alexander moved, the more his army would be forced to fragment. To garrison cities. To secure routes. To manage populations that did not yet accept his rule. From a doctrinal standpoint, this was a mistake by the invader. From a system standpoint, it was an opportunity. But doctrine has no category for victory that creates obligations. It has no framework for conquest that erodes combat power through success. That is why doctrine pointed Persian commanders in the wrong direction. If they fought early and lost, the war ended badly and quickly. If they fought early and won, the war still had to be managed, but now against an opponent who had proven himself. Victory would stabilize the system. Defeat would destabilize it beyond repair. Doctrine could not solve this dilemma. So Persian leadership faced a contradiction. They could follow doctrine and risk irreversible loss. Or they could violate doctrine and hope that time, space, and friction would succeed where battle might not. Most generals would not hesitate. They would fight. Not because it was optimal, but because it was legible. Fighting produces clear outcomes. Retreat produces ambiguity. And ambiguity is politically dangerous. Retreat invites accusations. Of weakness. Of betrayal. Of incompetence. A commander who retreats must justify absence, not action. That is why doctrine favors engagement. It aligns military action with political survivability. The Persian choice broke that alignment. By refusing to force a decisive battle early, leadership accepted political exposure in exchange for strategic leverage that might never materialize. This was not caution. It was a wager that the invader's system would collapse under its own complexity before the empire's cohesion failed. Doctrine warned against exactly this kind of gamble. And in most cases, doctrine would be right. But doctrine assumes that war is resolved by destruction. This war was being shaped to be resolved by exhaustion. And exhaustion does not follow rules. It follows thresholds. Thresholds of supply. Of morale. Of administrative bandwidth. Of tolerance for uncertainty. The Persian calculation was that Alexander would cross those thresholds first. That his brilliance would be diluted by distance. That his victories would outpace his capacity to consolidate them. That momentum would turn into overextension. But doctrine could not guarantee this outcome. Which raises the most dangerous question of all. If doctrine fails, what replaces it? Not improvisation. Not intuition. Something far more fragile. A set of assumptions. Assumptions about human behavior. About loyalty under pressure. About how long an army can move forward without stopping. Assumptions that, once chosen, cannot be partially reversed. Because once you allow the enemy to advance, you cannot suddenly demand a clean reset. The decision, once made, locks the system into a single trajectory. And it is at the moment doctrine was abandoned, when retreat stopped being temporary and became strategic, that this war crossed the point of no return. Unorthodox strategies rarely emerge from confidence. They emerge from constraint. By the time Persian leadership moved away from early confrontation, the decision was no longer framed as how to defeat Alexander. It had narrowed into something colder. How to survive his advance without collapsing internally. This distinction matters. Because what followed was not a single bold order, but a gradual alignment of incentives that made retreat the least dangerous option, not the safest one. At the center of the Persian system stood a leadership structure built for administration, not rapid doctrinal adaptation. Decision-making authority was layered. Information moved slowly. Consensus mattered more than speed. That structure was a liability in a fast war. But it also shaped how risk was perceived. A decisive early battle required concentrated force, unified command, and political commitment from multiple satrapies. Any failure would be immediately attributable to the center. Retreat, by contrast, diffused responsibility. Losses could be explained as local withdrawals. Delays could be blamed on logistics. Setbacks could be framed as temporary. This did not make retreat less dangerous. It made it more survivable politically, at least in the short term. Inside Persian command, opposition to retreat was predictable. Military elites warned that yielding territory would invite defection. Administrators feared tax collapse and unrest. Regional governors questioned whether imperial protection still existed. But no alternative offered certainty. The core assumption behind the unorthodox strategy was not that Alexander would fail. It was that he would be forced to change. Alexander's system thrived on clarity. Clear objectives. Clear command relationships. Clear battles with clear outcomes. Retreat denied him that clarity. Each advance created new obligations. New populations to control. New lines to secure. New decisions that had nothing to do with fighting. The Persian wager was that at some point, Alexander would have to choose. Continue advancing and risk fragmentation. Or pause and risk losing momentum. Either choice reduced his strategic advantage. This assumption was fragile, but not irrational. History offered precedents of overextended conquerors. Empires had bled themselves dry by winning too much, too fast. Persian leadership was betting that conquest had a carrying capacity, and that Alexander would exceed it. Another assumption followed. That loyalty under occupation would be shallow. Persia's system had ruled for generations. Its legitimacy was embedded in ritual, bureaucracy, and habit. Alexander's rule, by contrast, would arrive as disruption. The belief was that local elites would hedge. That resistance would simmer. That administration would grind down the invader faster than retreat ground down the empire. This was not optimism. It was risk transference. Persia accepted visible losses to impose invisible costs. But here lay the most dangerous element of the strategy. Retreat had to look intentional without looking weak. It had to signal control without delivering protection. That balance is almost impossible to maintain. Every step back risked being interpreted not as strategy, but as failure. Every unchallenged advance strengthened Alexander's narrative, which forced Persian leadership into a narrow corridor. They could not suddenly counterattack without revealing inconsistency. They could not retreat too fast without inviting collapse. They could not retreat too slow without forcing the decisive battle they were trying to avoid. This was not operational maneuver. It was systems management under stress. And systems under stress amplify internal contradictions. Satraps began recalculating loyalty. Some cooperated quietly with the invader. Others fortified their positions, preparing for autonomy. The center's authority weakened not because it was defeated, but because it was no longer visibly decisive. Meanwhile, Alexander adapted. He did not simply move forward blindly. He absorbed local structures. He preserved administrative frameworks where useful. He learned. The Persian strategy assumed a static opponent, or at least a slower learner. That assumption was never guaranteed. This is the core danger of unorthodox strategy. It does not just bet on the enemy making mistakes. It bets on the enemy failing to evolve. And evolution favors those with fewer internal constraints. Alexander commanded a small, cohesive force. He could experiment, adjust, reframe objectives. Persian leadership could not. Every adjustment required consensus. Every delay magnified uncertainty. The retreat strategy locked the empire into a posture that demanded discipline, patience, and internal unity. Precisely the qualities that prolonged pressure erodes. Once adopted, the strategy could not be abandoned without admitting failure. And it could not succeed without outlasting an opponent designed for speed. That is why this decision is so often misunderstood. It was not cowardice. It was not indecision. It was an attempt to fight a war that battlefield doctrine could no longer win. By shifting the contest to endurance, legitimacy, and administrative capacity. But that shift came with an unforgiving condition. The empire had to hold together longer than the invader could adapt. That was the real gamble. And the moment this gamble moved from theory into execution, the war entered its most unstable phase. A strategy does not fail on paper. It fails in motion. Once retreat became operational policy rather than contingency, the Persian system entered a phase where every action had to serve two masters at once. Delay the invader. and prevent internal collapse. This balance defined execution. Territory was not abandoned indiscriminately. Administrative centers were prioritized. Supply hubs were thinned, not erased. Routes were disrupted selectively, not scorched completely. The intent was precision without confrontation. Persian command sought to shape the environment rather than contest it. To force Alexander to move through space that resisted control, without providing a single focal point for decisive engagement. But execution introduced friction no theory could eliminate. First, logistics under retreat. Retreating forces must move faster than advancing ones, while carrying less and securing more. Persian units had to evacuate resources, protect civilians loyal to the regime, and maintain lines of communication backward, all while appearing organized. This is exponentially harder than advancing. Every delay in withdrawal risked encirclement. Every acceleration risked chaos. The retreat had to look controlled. If it looked panicked, the strategy died immediately. Second, command coherence. Persian authority depended on layered compliance. Orders flowed downward, but initiative flowed upward. Satraps were not interchangeable commanders. They governed regions with their own interests, risks, and timelines. Central directives to yield space collided with local realities. Some governors complied strictly. Others slowed retreat to protect revenue. Some negotiated privately with Alexander's envoys to hedge their bets. This variability was lethal. The strategy required synchronized retreat across vast distances. Instead, it produced uneven withdrawal, pockets of resistance, zones of ambiguity, and opportunities for the invader to exploit division. Third, the problem of garrison vacuum. Retreat creates absence. Every city abandoned left behind unresolved questions. Who maintains order? Who collects taxes? Who enforces law? Alexander did not need to conquer every city militarily. He only needed to arrive where authority had already thinned. Local elites, facing uncertainty, often chose accommodation over resistance. Not because they preferred Alexander, but because he was present. Presence matters. Persian retreat attempted to weaponize absence. Alexander weaponized arrival. This created a feedback loop. The more territory Persia yielded without confrontation, the more Alexander appeared inevitable. The more inevitable he appeared, the less resistance local structures offered. Execution thus risked accelerating the very consolidation it sought to delay. Fourth, the burden on Alexander's system. Here, the strategy briefly worked. As Alexander advanced, his army fragmented. Detachments were left behind. Supply lines stretched. Command became more complex. Every victory created new administrative problems. Holding territory required negotiation, coercion, and bureaucracy. Tasks that consumed attention and manpower. Momentum slowed. But slowing momentum did not equal reversal. The Persian calculation depended on a threshold, a point where administrative burden outweighed military advantage. That threshold proved elusive. Alexander adapted faster than anticipated. Instead of imposing entirely new structures, he co-opted existing ones. Instead of replacing elites wholesale, he absorbed them. Instead of resisting local customs, he leveraged them. This reduced friction. It also undermined the Persian assumption that occupation would be inherently unstable. The retreat strategy assumed occupation would rot from within. But rot takes time. And time was a resource Persia was bleeding. Fifth, morale under delayed resolution. For Persian forces, retreat without engagement produced corrosive uncertainty. Soldiers were not defeated, but they were not vindicated either. There were no victories to rally around. No decisive moments to restore confidence. Morale eroded quietly. For Alexander's troops, the opposite occurred. Every mile advanced reinforced belief. Every city entered confirmed narrative. Even logistical strain was interpreted as proof of progress. This asymmetry mattered. Strategy that depends on morale collapse must outpace morale reinforcement. Here, it did not. The most dangerous moments came when retreat nearly forced unintended confrontation. Supply bottlenecks. Miscommunication. Overlapping withdrawals. At several points, Persian forces risked being caught between retreating units and advancing Macedonian columns. Had this occurred decisively, the empire would have suffered the very catastrophic defeat it sought to avoid, without preparation. These were the micro-failures that haunted execution. Not because they happened, but because they could have happened at any time. The strategy allowed no margin for error. Every retreat had to succeed. Every coordination had to hold. The invader only needed one moment of clarity. This is the hidden cost of unorthodox strategy. It reduces visible confrontation but multiplies invisible failure points. The Persian system was managing a distributed risk environment with limited real-time control. Alexander operated a centralized force capable of rapid exploitation. Execution was therefore a race. Not between armies. Between systems. Between an empire attempting to remain intact under deliberate strain, and a conquering force learning how to rule while still moving. The strategy did not collapse immediately, but its window narrowed with each adaptation. And the moment Alexander began responding not as a raider but as a ruler, the logic of making victory heavy began to break down. Because the strategy only worked if conquest stayed lighter than control. And that balance was already shifting. A strategy designed to exhaust an enemy only works if the enemy reacts as expected. Persian leadership assumed that Alexander would behave like most conquerors before him. Advance fast. Win battles. Then slow down under the weight of what he had taken. That assumption was reasonable. It was also incomplete. Alexander did react, but not in the way the strategy required. The first signal Alexander received was not resistance, but absence. Cities opened without fighting. Satraps hesitated. Garrisons withdrew. To Persian planners, this absence was pressure. To Alexander, it was information. It suggested weakness, or at least indecision. And decisive leaders are trained to exploit ambiguity, not fear it. Alexander did not interpret Persian retreat as a trap. He interpreted it as opportunity. This was the first misalignment. Persian command expected retreat to create uncertainty in the invader's mind. Instead, it created clarity. The lack of early decisive resistance reinforced Alexander's belief that momentum itself was a weapon. That forward motion could substitute for consolidation. The second misinterpretation lay in doctrine. Persian leadership assumed Alexander would prioritize battlefield dominance over administrative absorption. That he would remain a commander first, a ruler later. This assumption underestimated Alexander's flexibility. Alexander did not wait for conquest to end before governing. He governed while advancing. Local elites were retained. Tax systems were adapted, not dismantled. Symbols of authority were preserved where useful. This reduced the administrative shock Persian planners had counted on. The strategy required occupation to feel foreign and unstable. Alexander made it feel continuous. The third error was structural. Persia expected Alexander's command system to strain under scale. Longer distances. Fragmented units. Slower communication. All of that occurred. But Alexander compensated by simplifying decisions. He delegated ruthlessly. He accepted local autonomy when it served speed. He prioritized loyalty over uniformity. Persian governance prized consistency. Alexander accepted asymmetry. This mattered. Persian retreat was designed to stretch a rigid system. Alexander operated a flexible one. The fourth and most consequential misreading concerned psychology. Persian planners believed that prolonged advance without closure would erode morale. That soldiers would grow weary of endless campaigning. Instead, the opposite happened. Alexander's troops interpreted continuous movement as success. Every city taken confirmed purpose. Every mile advanced validated sacrifice. Fatigue existed. But it was framed as progress, not stagnation. Persian forces, by contrast, experienced fatigue without affirmation. They retreated without narrative. They yielded without visible payoff. Morale eroded unevenly, and uneven erosion is destabilizing. The fifth miscalculation involved information flow. Persian leadership operated within a system that filtered bad news. Retreats were reported upward as controlled withdrawals. Local defections were minimized. Alexander's system rewarded real-time adaptation. Bad news traveled fast. Responses followed immediately. This asymmetry allowed Alexander to respond to developing opportunities while Persian command remained reactive. By the time the center understood the scale of accommodation and collaboration occurring locally, it was already irreversible. The final reaction error was temporal. Persian strategy depended on time working against the invader. But time only weakens systems that remain static. Alexander changed the equation by accelerating political consolidation. Instead of allowing friction to accumulate, he drained it. This did not eliminate risk. But it delayed collapse long enough for legitimacy to transfer. The moment local populations began to perceive Alexander not as a passing conqueror, but as a viable ruler, the retreat strategy lost leverage. At that point, Persian withdrawal no longer diluted victory. It concentrated it. The irony is sharp. The strategy relied on Alexander misunderstanding the cost of success. Instead, Persian leadership underestimated his capacity to redefine success itself. They expected a conqueror. They faced a system builder. And once that shift occurred, the logic of retreat unraveled. Not because retreat was wrong in principle, but because it depended on a static opponent in a dynamic war. The decisive mistake was not allowing Alexander to advance. It was assuming he would remain the same man at the end of that advance. The outcome of the strategy cannot be judged by territory alone. Territory was never the metric. The intent was exhaustion, delay, structural overload. Measured by those standards, the result was ambiguous, and that ambiguity is precisely the point. Alexander did not collapse under the weight of conquest. But neither did he emerge unchanged. The Persian retreat strategy failed to stop him. It succeeded in reshaping the war into something slower, heavier, and more fragile than his early campaigns suggested. This distinction matters because it reveals what the strategy actually purchased and what it consumed in return. First, the immediate outcome. Alexander continued advancing. Key administrative centers fell. Imperial authority fragmented. From a conventional perspective, this is failure. But the manner of that advance was not frictionless. Alexander's army was forced to disperse earlier than optimal. Command complexity increased. Operational tempo slowed. He was no longer fighting a clean war of movement. He was managing a growing political system under constant strain. The Persian strategy did not stop conquest. It altered its cost structure. That cost was not paid in decisive battles. It was paid in endurance. Second, the human cost. Retreat as strategy sacrifices populations by design. Civilians in yielded regions faced violence, requisition, displacement, and uncertainty. Imperial protection evaporated without replacement. This was not collateral damage. It was an accepted consequence. The Persian center chose to preserve systemic survival over local security. That choice fractured trust. Once protection is withdrawn deliberately, it is rarely restored. Many local elites adapted. Others resisted and paid the price. Either way, the social fabric was permanently altered. A strategy that depends on endurance must decide who is allowed to endure and who is not. Third, the logistical cost. Retreat consumed resources without generating visible returns. Tax bases shrank. Supply corridors were disrupted. Administrative continuity degraded. The empire was paying for a war it was not visibly fighting. This creates a dangerous dynamic. Costs are immediate. Benefits are speculative. Every month of retreat drained reserves while offering no confirmation that the gamble was working. Unlike a decisive battle, which resolves uncertainty quickly, this strategy extended it indefinitely. Extended uncertainty corrodes systems faster than loss. Fourth, the political cost. The most severe damage occurred inside the imperial structure. Authority relies on predictability. Retreat eroded it. Satraps learned that protection was conditional. Loyalty became transactional. Some hedged. Some defected. Some prepared for autonomy. The center's ability to compel behavior diminished. The retreat strategy required cohesion to succeed. But it actively undermined the mechanisms that produced cohesion. This is the central paradox. To weaken the invader, Persia weakened itself. Fifth, the psychological cost to leadership. Choosing retreat meant choosing invisibility. Victories inspire. Withdrawals demand explanation. Persian leaders bore responsibility for losses they could not immediately justify. They could not point to triumph. They could only point to process. Process does not satisfy political systems under stress. The longer the war continued without decisive reversal, the more leadership credibility decayed. Eventually, belief collapsed, not because the strategy was disproven, but because patience ran out. This is a cost rarely discussed. Unorthodox strategies isolate their authors. When success is delayed, doubt multiplies. When doubt multiplies, authority erodes. Sixth, the counterfactual: what if the strategy had failed faster? This is crucial. Had Alexander collapsed under logistical overload early? Had occupation ignited widespread resistance? Had internal fragmentation overtaken adaptation? The strategy would be remembered as genius. Its failure was not binary. It was temporal. It required the empire to hold longer than the invader adapted. It did not. But that does not make the logic invalid. It reveals its dependency. This strategy only works when the defending system has deeper reserves of cohesion than the attacking system has adaptability. Persia misjudged that balance. Alexander learned faster than the empire could endure ambiguity. The final cost is historical. By avoiding early decisive confrontation, Persia surrendered narrative control. Alexander's story became one of inevitability. Once inevitability takes hold, resistance shifts from strategic to symbolic. At that point, strategy no longer determines outcomes. Perception does. The Persian retreat strategy delayed defeat. It did not prevent it. But it also ensured that conquest would be costly, unstable, and dependent on continuous adaptation. Alexander won. But he won a war that could not easily end. That, too, is a cost. And the question that remains is not whether the strategy failed, but whether it was the only option that avoided immediate collapse. This was never a story about retreat. It was a story about where war actually ends. Most military analysis assumes that wars end when one side can no longer fight. This case challenges that assumption. The Persian strategy was not designed to defeat Alexander's army. It was designed to defeat Alexander's capacity to convert victory into permanence. That distinction is the key. At its core, this strategy rejected a foundational rule of warfare. That territorial control is the primary measure of success. Instead, it treated territory as a variable, something expendable, and focused on a deeper objective: to overload the enemy's system. This reframes the war entirely. The Persian leadership was not asking, "How do we stop him?" They were asking, "How do we make his success unsustainable?" This is why the strategy feels alien even today. Modern doctrine still privileges decisive engagement, shock, and tempo. But this strategy attacked something far less visible: administrative bandwidth, political legitimacy, psychological endurance. The first rule it broke was the cult of immediacy. Most commanders are trained to resolve threats quickly. Speed is equated with competence. Persia chose delay. Not delay as hesitation, but delay as pressure. Pressure that accumulates silently. The second rule it broke was the belief that legitimacy flows only from force. Persian leadership understood something uncomfortable. That legitimacy does not vanish when land is lost. It vanishes when authority fails to make sense of events. Their retreat sought to preserve the meaning of authority, even as its geography shrank. This was an attempt to separate rule from presence. A radical idea, and a dangerous one. The third rule it broke was the assumption that conquest is self-limiting. Most military thinking assumes that overextension punishes the attacker automatically. This strategy tried to accelerate that punishment. But here lies the lesson. Overextension only destroys systems that cannot adapt. Alexander's system adapted. He did not attempt to rule Persia as Persia had ruled itself. He hybridized. He absorbed structures instead of replacing them. He delegated without uniformity. He prioritized loyalty over coherence. In doing so, he neutralized the core mechanism of the Persian plan. This exposes the central truth. The retreat strategy did not fail because it was flawed in concept. It failed because it depended on an enemy remaining predictable. Unorthodox strategies are not fragile because they are complex. They are fragile because they are conditional. They only work if multiple assumptions hold simultaneously. In this case, those assumptions were that the invader would struggle to govern, that local elites would resist foreign rule, that internal cohesion could outlast uncertainty, that adaptation would be slower than exhaustion. None of these were guaranteed. And once even one failed, the entire structure weakened. This reveals a broader principle. Unorthodox strategy is not about cleverness. It is about control over uncertainty. Persia attempted to control uncertainty by distributing it across space, across time, across society. Alexander concentrated uncertainty inside his own system, and then actively managed it. That difference decided the war. There is a final, uncomfortable insight. This strategy did not misunderstand Alexander. It misunderstood itself. It assumed that an empire could endure prolonged ambiguity without dissolving. That authority could survive retreat without visible compensation. That patience could be enforced indefinitely. Empires are not built for ambiguity. They are built for continuity. When continuity breaks, even rational strategies lose their foundation. So what is the real lesson? Not that retreat is weak. Not that decisive battle is obsolete. But that strategy must match the system executing it. Persia chose a strategy that required extraordinary internal cohesion at a moment when cohesion was already eroding. Alexander exploited that mismatch. And that is why this war remains so unsettling. Because the Persian strategy was not stupid. It was not passive. It was not ignorant. It was intelligent and mistimed. Which leads to the most important conclusion of all. Some strategies are not wrong. They are simply chosen too late. And when that happens, even the most sophisticated plan becomes indistinguishable from surrender, not because it lacked logic, but because the system could no longer carry it. Alexander the Great is remembered for what he conquered. The Persian Empire is remembered for what it lost. That framing misses the deeper truth. This war was not decided by a single battle, or even a sequence of battles. It was decided by a collision between two systems operating on different clocks. Alexander moved fast. Persia tried to last. Speed versus endurance. Adaptation versus cohesion. The Persian retreat strategy was an attempt to shift war away from spectacle and into structure. Away from killing power and into administrative gravity. It nearly worked. Not because Alexander faltered, but because his victories came close to costing him control. In the end, the strategy failed not on the battlefield, but inside the empire that tried to wield it. Retreat without unity is collapse delayed. Endurance without legitimacy is erosion disguised as patience. Alexander did not defeat Persia because he was stronger everywhere. He defeated it because he learned faster than the system resisting him could hold together. That is the uncomfortable lesson this war leaves behind. Not that boldness always wins, but that timing decides which intelligence matters. Some strategies are only visible in hindsight. Others are only viable before history closes certain doors. Persia chose a strategy that belonged to a stronger version of itself. One that no longer existed. And Alexander walked through that gap. Quietly. Relentlessly. Not because he was unstoppable, but because the structure opposing him had already begun to loosen under its own weight.